50,000 years. When Europe had no civilization to speak of, these people were already here. When the pyramids of Egypt hadn't yet been built, these people were already here. For 50,000 years, one people held onto one continent and never let go. And they didn't just survive, they knew. They knew the name of every star in the night sky. They could read the land like a book that took 50 millennia to write. Then one day, white sails appeared on the horizon. January 1788, the middle of the Australian summer. Cutting through the ocean came 11 British ships, inside 736 convicts. And from that single morning, a world 50,000 years in the making began to fall apart. But this is not where the story ends. This is where it begins. Because what happened over the next 113 years was not simply the story of a country being born. It was a story of betrayal, of survival, of greed, of gold, of democracy, and ultimately the story of an impossible dream that somehow came true. Stay with me, because what comes next will change the way you see Australia forever. Long before any European ship ever crossed the Southern Ocean, this land was alive. For 50,000 years, longer than any civilization in recorded history, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples called this continent home. They were not primitive wanderers. They were sophisticated societies with complex languages, spiritual tradition, trade networks, and a profound connection to the land that modern science is only beginning to understand. They called it home. They knew every star in the sky, every season of the earth, every secret of the landscape. And then, from the other side of the world, came a nation that knew none of this. Britain in the 1770s was an empire at the height of its power, but it had a problem, a serious, urgent, overflowing problem. Its jails were bursting, crime was rising, and the one place it had been sending its convicts, America, had just declared independence and slammed the door shut. Britain needed a new answer, and a young naval officer named James Cook had recently handed them one. January 18, 1788, after 8 months at sea, 11 ships appeared on the horizon off the coast of New South Wales. On board, 736 convicts, men and women, thieves, debtors, political prisoners. Most had never been on a ship before. Many believed they were sailing to their deaths. Their commander, Captain Arthur Phillip, was a man of quiet determination. As his ships entered Sydney Cove, he looked out at the dense bush, the shimmering harbor, and made a decision that would echo through history. This would be the place. On January 26, 1788, the British flag was raised on Australian soil for the first time. The convicts stumbled ashore, sick, exhausted, terrified. They were handed axes and told to build a colony from nothing. But they were not alone. Watching from the trees, with curiosity and growing unease, were the Eora people, the Aboriginal inhabitants of this land. They had seen nothing like this before. They could not have known that this single morning would mark the beginning of the end of their ancient world. The early years were brutal. The soil was poor. The crops failed. Starvation stalked the colony. At one point, rations were cut so severely that even the officers went hungry. Supply ships from Britain took months to arrive and sometimes didn't come at all. But the convicts survived. They built roads. They cleared forests. They slowly, painfully transformed a wilderness into a settlement. And as the colony expanded, the violence began. The British had declared this land terra nullius, legally empty, belonging to no one. It was one of history's greatest lies. As settlers pushed further into Aboriginal territory, they were met with resistance. And the British response was devastating. Massacres, disease, displacement. An entire people whose ancestors had thrived here for millennia were being erased from their own land. It is the darkest chapter of Australia's story, and it cannot be told without acknowledging this truth. Decades passed, and something unexpected began to happen. Britain kept creating new colonies across the continent. Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania, became a separate colony in 1825, a remote island used for the most hardened criminals. Then came Western Australia in 1829, South Australia in 1836, Victoria in 1851, and Queensland in 1859. 6 colonies, 1 continent, but no single nation. Each colony had its own government, its own laws, its own customs, its own railway system, and its own fierce pride. A man crossing from New South Wales into Victoria needed to pay customs duties as if he were entering a foreign country. Trains couldn't cross colonial borders because the rail gauges were different sizes. Soldiers from one colony couldn't legally defend another. Australia existed on the map, but as a nation, it simply didn't exist. Then in 1851, everything accelerated. Gold was discovered in Victoria, and within months, Australia was transformed. Ships from Britain, America, China, and Europe poured into Australian ports. The population of Victoria alone exploded from 77,000 to over 500,000 in just a decade. Tent cities rose overnight in the bush. Fortunes were made and lost in a single afternoon. The goldfields were wild, chaotic, and electric with possibility. Men from 50 different nations worked side by side under the brutal Australian sun. A new culture was being born, rough, independent, suspicious of authority, fiercely egalitarian. And out of this chaos emerged something unexpected, an Australian identity. Not British, not convict, something entirely new. The question was beginning to form in people's mind. If we are all Australians, why are we still 6 separate countries? As the colonies grew richer, they grew more confident. One by one, they demanded and received self-government from Britain. By the 1850s, each colony had its own elected parliament. Australia became one of the first places on Earth to introduce the secret ballot. Working men won the right to vote. Women in South Australia gained the vote in 1894, decades before women in Britain or America. These were not small achievements. They were radical, world-changing ideas being tested in a young, restless continent. But with political power came political rivalry. Each colony competed for trade, for migrants, for railways, for prestige. The dream of unity seemed further away than ever, until one man stood up and spoke the words that changed everything. October 24, 1889. Tenterfield, New South Wales. An aging politician with a magnificent white beard stepped onto a stage and delivered a speech that would rewrite the future. His name was Henry Parkes, and he told Australia what it needed to hear. "The time has come," he said, "for the creation on this earth of an Australian nation." The applause was thunderous, but the road ahead was anything but simple. For the next decade, politicians, lawyers, and ordinary citizens argued, debated, and negotiated the terms of a possible union. Constitutional conventions were held across the colonies. Hundreds of clauses were debated. Compromises were made and broken. Small colonies feared being swallowed by large ones. Queensland almost refused to join entirely. Western Australia hesitated until the very last moment. And always, behind the political theater, was a deeper question. What kind of nation did Australians want to be? What makes Australia's federation truly extraordinary is this: the people voted for it. In 1898 and 1899, referendums were held across the colonies. Ordinary men, farmers, miners, shopkeepers, teachers, cast their votes on one of the most complex constitutional documents ever written. They said yes, not because politicians told them to, but because they believed in something bigger than themselves. It was democracy in its most powerful form. The final draft of the Australian Constitution was sent to London. After months of negotiation and a few last-minute British changes that infuriated Australian leaders, Queen Victoria gave her royal assent. The Commonwealth of Australia Constitution Act was passed by the British Parliament on July 9, 1900. Australia was almost a nation. Almost. New Year's Day 1901, Sydney, Centennial Park. 100,000 people gathered under a blazing summer sky. They came from every colony, every walk of life, every corner of this vast continent. There were soldiers in uniform, women in white dresses, children waving flags, Old men who remembered the gold rush, young men who had only ever known this land as home. And at precisely noon, it happened. The Commonwealth of Australia was proclaimed. 6 colonies, in one extraordinary moment, became one nation. Edmund Barton was sworn in as Australia's first Prime Minister. The crowd erupted. Bells rang. Cannons fired. People wept. 113 years after the first convict ships arrived, a nation had been born. But here is what makes this story truly remarkable. Australia was not born through revolution, not through war, not through the will of a king or the conquest of an army. It was born through conversation, through debate, through democracy, through the slow, difficult, deeply human process of people choosing to become something greater together. The Australia of 1901 was far from perfect. Aboriginal Australians were excluded from the new constitution. The White Australia policy was among the first laws the new parliament passed. There were injustices that would take generations to even begin to address. But the foundation had been laid. And on that foundation, one of the world's great democracies would be built. From 50,000 years of Aboriginal civilization, to 11 ships carrying convicts into an unknown harbor, to 6 rival colonies learning, slowly and painfully, to trust each other. This is the untold story of how Australia became a nation. It didn't happen overnight. It happened through more than a century of hardship, migration, conflict, vision, and an extraordinary belief that something better was possible. And on January 1, 1901, the world gained one of its youngest nations, with one of its longest, most dramatic, and most remarkable origin stories. The story of Australia had only just begun.